It's all about preservation. It's all about finding these places wherever they are and asking the owners to spend a night in these spaces and using the leverage garnered from that particular sleepover to let these stewards of these places know that it's okay.
Joe McGill, founder of the Slave Dwelling Project, is discussing why he's been visiting slave dwellings for 8 years now.
I find slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States, and I ask the owners if I could spend a night in these spaces. We tend to tell the history of the United States through the buildings we preserve. There was a tendency not to preserve slave dwellings because it's an element of history that we tend to forget, want to forget, and sometimes do forget.
The Irving Art Center partnered with the Dallas Heritage Village so that Joe could share his stories and the importance of preserving these historical sites.
If you think about particularly southern plantation houses, we preserve the big house, we preserve sort of the pretty side, but the cabins and the places where the enslaved were not preserved traditionally, and so he wanted to raise awareness for that, and so he started spending the night in slave dwellings to help raise that awareness.
These structures, so many of them have been lost because they, when they were no longer being used as slave dwellings, demolition by neglect. They fell down. It's also a painful part of our history that it's not comfortable to talk about this stuff, and so I think there's a gateway, but because clearly we do need to talk about this with all the things that are happening in our country today. It's not a story that stays isolated in the past. It's something that the ripple effects are still very much felt today.
Joe has visited landmarks in 23 states. 7 of those states have been northern.
Which seems to surprise people the most because when they think about slavery, they think about plantations in the South. Well, it did happen there, but you're limiting your definition of slavery if you just limit it to those places. Because you don't think about the urban slavery, you don't think about the slavery in the northern states, and you don't really think about the slavery as it continued westward into states like Texas.
During his presentation, Joe also explained what it felt like to stay in the slave dwellings overnight.
When I thought about enslaved people trying to escape, maybe, and what they thought about their place in life, their lot in life, but knowing that those places where they were at that time inside those 4 walls was probably the most serene time of their lives because beyond those walls it was a regimented life of just working and your labor being exploited and you're not being able to benefit from any of your own labor. 3 people stayed with me that night, 2 white gentlemen who were descendants of slave owners, and an African-American female. She was a descendant of an enslaver and one of his enslaved women. So you could best believe that we have some very powerful conversations.
Joe McGill's presentation of the Slave Dwelling Project served as a reminder of the people who lived in these structures and what they went through.
I stood on that auction block and I thought about enslaved people standing on auction blocks to show their backs to that potential buyer, to let that potential buyer know that there are no marks on his or her back, because that potential buyer would not buy an enslaved person with marks on his or her back. That's a sign of a defined enslaved person. And why buy a defined enslaved person?
Exploring the harsh reality of the free and privileged between the enslaved and deprived. For About Town, this is Susan Stevens.